Hi, welcome back. Chandamama had been the all-time best monthly magazine for children published since 1947. However, Chandamama's publication stopped in the year 2012. Chandamama was said to be the replica of great Indian culture, heritage, tradition and custom. And then thousands of this magazine's stories are said to be the moral boosters for the people of all age groups. And here, let me narrate one of the finest stories of Chandamama. The title of the story is A Novel Way to Teach. Let us go through the story.
Grandpa, would you then say that the Brihat Katha is the world's first collection of tales?
Chameli asked Professor Devnath eagerly. She reminded him of that once he had told that Brihat Katha was the world's first collection of tales. Then take a look at what grandfather says. Yes, my child, confirmed the professor. Chameli opened a magazine and drew the professor's attention to an article. It was on another ancient book of stories, the Panchthantra. The author of the article had described the book as the first collection of tales written in India. Here there is a contradiction. One such a moment, this girl's grandfather told her that Brihat Katha was the world's first collection of tales. But here Panchatantra was also claimed to be the first collection of stories in India. Then which is the right?
If the Brihat Katha is the first collection of tales in the world, it had to be the first collection of tales in India too. If the Panchatantra is the first collection of tales in India, it must have been older than the Brihat Katha. That means the Panchatantra is the oldest book of tales in the world,
commented Chameli. The girl here comes up with an interesting logic. If Brihat Katha is the first collection of tales in the world, then it should be the oldest collection of tales in India as well. On the other hand, if Panchatantra is the first collection of tales in India, it must have been older than the Brihat Katha. Eventually, the girl concluded that Panchatantra is older than Brihat Katha. Is it right? Well, Chameli, the author of this article is partly right and partly wrong. While Gunaja's Brihat Katha is considered older than the Panchatantra, it is a lost property of humanity. The part of the book which we read today is Kathasarit Sagara. This was written by Somadeva in the 11th century, whereas the Panchatantra was written in the 3rd century, if not earlier. The professor paused for a while. So, her grandfather was a professor. Here, the professor has made an interesting observation. According to him, Kathasarit Sagara, written by Somadeva, was compiled in 11th century. On the other hand, Panchatantra was written in the 3rd century, if not earlier. The granddaughter says,
Grandpa, you can continue after you have had your cup of tea. Sandeep is bringing it,
said Chameli. So Sandeep could be of her brother. Chameli suggested her grandpa to have a cup of tea, which is brought by her brother Sandeep. Let it come, I am in no hurry, said Devnath. As I was saying, there need not be any quarrel even between the Kathasarit Sagara and the Panchatantra. Both are first in their own ways. The Kathasarit Sagara is the first collection of tales. The Panchatantra is the first collection of fables, said the professor. Great indeed was Vishnu Sharma. What a challenge he took up and how successfully he met, grandfather says. So according to him, Panchatantra is the first collection of fables. Fables means short stories consisting of animals and they convey morals. On the other hand, tales means fictitious stories. Now Sandeep speaks on. Challenge, did you say, Grandpa? You told us the story behind the origin of the Brihat Katha. Is there a story behind the origin of the Panchatantra too? Asked Sandeep, who had in the meanwhile entered the professor's room with a cup of tea for him. He continues. There was a kingdom called Mahilarupya ruled by a king named Amar Shakti. He should have been a happy king but for the conduct of his 3 sons. They were not bad boys, but they had one weakness. and quite a formidable weakness was that they didn't like to learn anything. They could not tolerate the sight of a teacher. The king tried his best to drive a little good sense into their thick skulls, but in vain. Here, the grandfather was narrating a story. In the story, once there lived a king and he had 3 sons, but all the 3 sons didn't show any sort of interest in learning. One of the boys, after all, had to succeed him to the throne. It's obvious that one among the 3 boys should occupy the throne of his dad. How could he hand over the administration of the kingdom to a young man who refused to be educated? The king was worried and he called the renowned scholars and thinkers of his kingdom and frankly placed his problem before them. Please advise me how I can go about educating my sons, he said. He asked them what to do to get his sons educated. The scholars made several suggestions, but none of them appeared to be practical. The king was about to give up hope when one of them advised him to consult Vishnu Sharma, a wise man who had highly original ways of solving knotty problems. Finally, one of the scholars has delivered a sensible suggestion. He advised Vishnu Sharma would be the right teacher to get his sons educated. Vishnu Sharma went to the palace at the king's invitation. The king must have been deeply impressed by his wit and knowledge. When the wise man took it upon himself to educate the 3 princes, the king offered him plenty of wealth. But Vishnu Sharma refused to accept any, saying, I will not sell education. Besides, I have no use for wealth because I am pretty old. Vishnu Sharma made friends with the boys and led them to a lonely spot, probably on the roof of the palace where the shade from a banyan tree fell. The king offered money to Vishnu Sharma for his son's education, but Vishnu Sharma rejected it smoothly. Vishnu Sharma made friends with the boys and led them to a lonely spot, probably on the roof of the palace where the shade from a banyan tree fell. He began. On the banks of the river Godavari stood a huge shalmali tree to which birds from many directions came to roost. And then he went on narrating story after story of people, good and bad, of trust and treachery, cleverness and naivete, luck and the lack of it, crime and punishment, cunning and innocence. There were stories within stories, and one story led to another, a typical ancient Indian style of storytelling which was later adapted in the Arabian Nights. So, much to the amusement of the 3 sons of the king, Vishnu Sharma narrated story after story, story within story, and several stories in such a manner, and which formed the typical ancient style of India, and which was later adapted by Arabian Nights. By the time the sage and scholar Vishnu Sharma ended his series of sessions with the princes, they stood educated without realizing that they had been taught. They were observed in the stories, and through these stories, the great teacher taught them politics, diplomacy, psychology, sociology, all the subjects the princes ought to learn. And wonder what? Just by narrating stories after stories, Vishnu Sharma taught the sons of the king diplomacy, psychology, sociology, and several other subjects including politics. The term Panchatantra means 5 categories of knowledge. Panchatantra means 5 categories of knowledge. As the professor paused, Chameli pleaded with him sweetly,
Grandpa, would you care to tell us at least one story from this great book?
Chameli pleads her grandfather to narrate at least one story from the great book Panchatantra. Now, here goes the story narrated by the professor to his granddaughter. My child, I am sure you know many of the stories from the Panchatantra. For example, don't you know the story of the monkey which killed his sleeping master by trying to kill a fly that sat on his forehead? So that's one of the stories. Don't you remember the story of the turtle which remained hanging from a stick held by 2 swans and which fell to its death because it opened its mouth unnecessarily? So that's another interesting story. Also, I am sure you know the story of the three friends who knew the secret of reviving a dead lion without knowing how to protect themselves from it. Of course, we know them, but are they all from the Panchatantra? Exclaimed Sandeep. This time Sandeep exclaimed. They are. However, let me tell you the shortest story in the book, which is of most relevance to mankind today. Barring all these stories briefed by Professor, he is all set to narrate one more shortest story. You have read reports of double-headed snakes and even human child born with two heads? Well, the Panchatantra tells us that once there was a bird with two heads. The heads were so situated on the body that they looked in opposite directions. One day, one head found some nectar in a shell. Once upon a time, there lived a double-headed snake. Double-headed snake means it's a snake consisting two heads on both of its sides. One day, one head found some nectar in a shell. So, one head finds a nectar in a shell. The second head wanted a share of it but was refused. Greedily, all the nectar was swallowed by the one side of the head. Soon the second head found some poison and drank it. The second head wanted to teach the first head a lesson. As such, it drank some poison and died. Since both the heads belong to the same body, the poison killed the two-headed bird, said the professor and looked meaningfully at his grandchildren. The professor wants to get the description of the moral from his grandchildren. We understand mankind belongs to a single earth. Such is the situation today that any thoughtless action by one country on the earth could endanger the entire earth, said Sandeep. Professor Devnath smiled with satisfaction. So dear friends and students, that's all about this session. And I will be coming up with yet another interesting topic in my next session. Until then, bye. Thanks for watching.